This collection of essays, as Perry said, originated in the 13th annual Medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque conference sponsored by the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures. Anne Cruz and I were interested in exploring the different aspects of women's rule across Europe, and we were not disappointed. We learned about the usual suspects, of course, Isabel of Castile and Elizabeth I, but we also learned about lesser-known rulers, such as Catherine of Brandenburg, elected Prince of Transylvania. And I'm going to go to her. That's Catherine. Eva Deak, the author of the article, showed that Catherine's situation indicates the contradictions between theory and practice when it comes to women's sovereignty. She was a legitimate ruler, highly educated as a princely woman, whose marriage contract established her own court and established her place in the succession in case her husband died, which indeed he did. And then she was actually, the parliament duly elected her, so she was installed. But she nevertheless faced enormous difficulties as a ruler because of her gender. Although the Ottoman Sultan accepted her election, her rule was limited by the governor and the council, and she was considered unfit to rule during the country's military crisis. So she only ruled about a year. So a very interesting contradiction there between what she was legitimately entitled to do, but in fact was not allowed to do. This gap between theory and practice has also worked in favor of women. For example, in France, where Salic law prescribed women's rule, or even a male ruler tracing his descent through the female line, female regents such as Catherine de' Medici, that's a Clouet painting of Catherine when she was younger. You'll see a picture of her when she was actually quite powerful as a widow and regent, and Anne of Austria. This is a Rubens painting of Anne of Austria, 17th century. These rulers became extremely powerful because as mothers of kings, they were considered safer placeholders than uncles of the young kings who might move to usurp the throne for themselves. Recently, a French scholar, Eliane Vianot, has shown that this prohibition was in fact a fiction to justify male rule and exclude women from power. In fact, the original law of the Salian Franks said nothing about excluding women from rule or even landholding. Christine de Pizan's well-known The Book of the City of Ladies discusses many female rulers from French history. And actually you can see the ladies building the city, and you can see Christine with the three ladies who come to visit her at the beginning of the Book of City of Ladies. One of Christine's important patrons was Isabeau of Bavaria, wife of Charles VI, to whom she is dedicating her work in this illustration. She exhorted Isabeau in an open letter to intervene in the Civil War ravaging France. Tracy Adams shows that her writings were meant to be read aloud by the public as mirrors of magistrates to promote the idea of a powerful woman ruler as an effective mediator of peace. Thus, Isabeau was the basis of Christine's political theory concerning women's rule and the role of women in late medieval France when the monarchical system was under siege. Eva Deak traveled from Hungary, and Tracy Adams came all the way from Australia to share their work with us. One of the distinctions of her volume is that a number of the essays emphasizes transnational and transcultural relations. Catherine of Valois may be familiar to you as the French princess that Henry V woos at the end of Shakespeare's play. Remember that one? Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson in his film adaptation of Henry V. Catherine later became wife of Owen Tudor, and she thereby established the Tudor line. Sandra Logan calls attention to the contradiction between Catherine's multiple roles vis-à-vis the monarchy. She was the sister and the daughter of the French king, and also the wife and mother of English kings. These roles gave her access to considerable power, but she was erased from the English genealogical and historical representations in order to assert the Englishness of the royal succession. If you recall in the movie, she's this sort of sweet, naive princess, although some Shakespeare scholars have seen her to be more knowing than she lets on, and her sort of broken English sort of further serves to infantilize her. So she's thus represented by Shakespeare as a pawn between her vanquished father and the victorious English king. Shakespeare's queen was, of course, Elizabeth Tudor, who ruled in the wake of the controversy concerning women's rule, best articulated in Protestant reformer John Knox's The First Blast of the Trumpet Against a Monstrous Regimen of Women, which was written during the reign of two Catholic female monarchs, Mary I and her cousin Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Although Knox's objection was primarily based on religion, he emphasized women's disability by saying that women's rule was tantamount to the blind leading the sighted. Elizabeth's own ambassador to France, Sir Thomas Smith, stated that queens can rule because their rank trumped their gender, and also because they would be guided by wise male counselors like himself. Carol Levin, a Tudor historian and the author of an important study of Elizabeth, The Heart and Stomach of a King, Elizabeth I and the Politics of Sex and Power, discusses the monarch's deft, if often ambivalent and fraught, negotiation of sibling relations with Edward, who was at once her younger brother and her sovereign. And this is a painting that Elizabeth presented to her brother when he was king. And especially with her elder sister, Mary I, who accused her of treason and imprisoned her in the Tower of London. Upon her ascension to the throne, Elizabeth also used the expected exchange of gifts with her subjects as a way to assert her own sovereignty, at the same time enabling her subjects to affirm and consolidate political loyalty. Catherine Howey examines the New Year's exchange of gifts between the Queen and her subjects, which were carefully recorded, and exchanges between the Queen and foreign sovereigns and ambassadors as tools of statecraft. And I'm going to show you one picture of Elizabeth and all her finery, because a lot of the gifts were items of clothing, and sometimes husbands and wives would put together an outfit and give Elizabeth the outfit, and these are all recorded in the New Year gift rolls. The gentlemen in the Queen's privy chamber directed the gifts to be given and managed the gifts received, thereby participating in the network that supported Elizabeth's sovereignty. This interest in subjects' relationships to their sovereign informs my own essay, which discusses a work of political counsel addressed to Queen Elizabeth by Anne Dowridge. This is the title page of the work. Dowridge's work, titled The French History, is a selective verse rendering of a history of the French wars of religion. In this work, Dowridge provides political advice to Elizabeth not to follow the example of Catherine of Medici. And here she is, in a much later painting than the one you saw earlier. Catherine de' Medici, whom she represents as a Machiavellian ruler responsible for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, in which Protestants were slaughtered by Catholics. Dowridge ostensibly calls attention to the contrast between Catherine and Elizabeth, yet the inescapable similarities between the two as female rulers can be read as an implicit critique of Elizabeth, who was in fact allied with the French. She exchanged letters with Catherine, and she was also engaged in marriage negotiations with one of Catherine's sons, the Duke of Alençon. By using the form of the verse history and a male narrator through which the story is told, Dowridge carefully uses indirection to avoid the dire fate of those who spoke and wrote too directly in counseling the Queen. For example, the Puritan lawyer John Stubbs, who had his hand chopped off for publishing a work advising the Queen against the French match. In fact, I see Dowridge as writing in the tradition of Christine de Pizan as a female counselor to a female monarch. Now, I have to stop here because there are other essays, and I can't tell you about all of them because I need to leave enough time for Anne to talk about the very interesting relationships between the various Spanish monarchs that figure in our collection.
Well, good evening, and I'd like to thank, first of all, Perry Lee Roberts for her introduction, and Mitchell Kaplan for having us here at Books and Books, for inviting us to speak to you on a topic that, although academic, continues to be important if our own elections have anything to say on the subject. Historians routinely call the 17th century the century of absolutism, of the century of great kings. And so it was particularly significant for Mihoko and me to deal with the 16th century, because this century might well be called the century of women rulers. And in fact, we wanted to call the book, the title of the book, Queen Takes King, but unfortunately the title was already taken. So, so we have not only do we have queen regnants, we have queen mothers, regents, princesses, and even, as Mihoko said, a female prince. Now, in early modern Spain, women have had a long history of sovereignty. And of course, beginning with Isabel la Católica, also known as Isabel of Castile, who actually usurped the throne from her niece with some help from the nobility, and to become the first queen regnant of early modern Europe at the age of 23. Now, when she was 17 years old, she had married Fernando de Aragon. Not a very good picture, but her marriage to Fernando de Aragon, of course, brought together two of the largest kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, Castile and Aragon. And of course, from 1492, the rest, as you know, was history. However, that history has always sided with a view that these two monarchs reigned as one. The chapter in our book that deals with Isabel of Castile was written by the Barbara Weisberger, who is a scholar of Isabel de Castilla, and what she talks about in her chapter is she explains how all of the devices, the signs, and the symbols that they basically had invented for them were meant to give the impression of this union, given the considerable resistance to female sovereignty, both in Castile and in Aragon. But in real life, Isabel was, of course, the stronger of the two. She was far more powerful than Fernando, and their heraldic shield, as you can see there, shows this by having her arms on the upper left, over those of Fernando's.